Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Peter Wells. Peter is Pro Dean of Public Value at Cardiff Business School, the Director of the Center for Automotive Industry Research, and a Professor of Business and Sustainability. He is also active in the Cardiff University Electric Vehicle Center of Excellence. His research and publishing interests are primarily focused on socio-technical transitions in the global automotive industry, mobility studies including electric bicycles and car sharing, and on sustainable business models in the circular economy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Peter Wells. Peter is the Director of the Center for Automotive Industry Research and Professor of Business and Sustainability at Cardiff Business School. Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So I know you're these and many other things, and so please tell us more about yourself and how you came to where you are today.
Well, could be a long story, it could be a short one. I think, well, like many students, when I was a student, I had no idea what I wanted to do next. So one of the obvious solutions was to carry on being a student. So I did my undergraduate degree in geography, I did a master's degree, an MSc in planning, and then I had an opportunity to win a scholarship for a PhD, which I did on the interface between military R&D spending and social development in the UK. And then by that time, I decided that university life was a life I could happily kind of coexist with. And I got interested in the whole world of research. I didn't really want to be a mainstream lecturer as such. And another opportunity came up. I've been very lucky in life, opportunities, doors open just when you need a door to open. An opportunity came up to undertake a research project on the automotive industry with a guy who was very well known in the industry as an academic. And so I joined his research group and continued as a contract researcher for the next 18 or so years. Outside of the mainstream of academic life in that sense, but loving the work, what a fantastic job. You get paid to travel the world, see lots of really interesting things. And I was always fascinated by, not the cars themselves. I don't care about the cars. Let's get this clear. I'm not a car person. I'm a bike fetishist, if anything. But I really got interested in how come these cars are so prevalent? How come automobility is such a big thing? And how come this industry has been so successful? What lies behind it? And how does it all work? And so I thought of the industry as almost like the machine rather than the car. And so from that point of view, I've just loved researching this industry from so many different perspectives. And perhaps for your listeners to understand, I'm not a discipline specialist. Most academics work within specified disciplines or sub-disciplines within, say, business and economics. But I'm not really one of those. I'm actually a subject specialist. I specialize on the automotive industry. And that's relatively unusual in the academic world. It's been quite tough in some ways because, of course, life, the way you progress through academia it's largely through the disciplines. But, I've survived. I'm still here. So I've enjoyed it on the way.
And you're on our podcast because you're an expert to talk to. So
that's right. Well, and I'm prepared to talk to a lot of people. And I think that's another distinguishing feature. I love the communication piece. One part of my background is as a street entertainer. I worked on the streets, literally.
Wow.
We had a van, we traveled around, we went to Spain, we lived up in the mountains. I performed at Glastonbury Festival one time.
Oh my God.
And once you get into that kind of line of work and improvisation and especially the interaction with audiences, and I've always loved that. And communicating with different people, different cultures. So this kind of role really suits me.
Oh, amazing. This is nothing for you then. You're improvising on the streets. That's much tougher stuff for
absolutely. When you have to perform fire juggling for money in order to eat, then in comparison, this is relatively straightforward.
Yeah, certainly. What a fascinating background. And I actually am also fascinated by
when I meet subject experts. I feel like we jump around so many things, and therefore we heavily rely on subject experts because we can only go into many different subjects or projects if we collaborate with subject experts. Otherwise, it's impossible to really get an understanding of what we're looking at. I'm also fascinated by the automotive industry just because whether you are a car owner or not, it's such a common thread in all of our lives. Like whether we want to or like it or not, we're around them. When we cross the street, we cross the street from them. When we are ride sharing, we're on an Uber, we're on a Lyft, we're in a car. Somebody has a car, and like it's almost like fashion, where clothing is a very common piece in everybody's life, and so is automotive. So we all have a connection to it one way or another, and yet it is an industry that is both like very fast growing, but at the same time very archaic in some ways too, in terms of like the shift. And we're not necessarily, I mean, I'm sure like there are, car freaks and car owners who know so much about cars and the car futures and what type of car they want. But I don't think we have enough understanding or the connection to the industry, and why do we see it progressing in some ways exponentially, maybe compared to other industries, and in some ways it's very slow. So if you can give us sort of like this is a very loaded question, but and like some of the like the lay of the land, and what do we see in the industry today, where are we at, and issues that we're seeing and their underlying reasons.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think you've really kind of nailed it, Pinar, in a sense, because this industry has been fundamentally stable for about 100 or so years in terms of the way it produces cars, the way it sells cars, and of course for us, the way we use cars, it's all been fairly fixed. Okay, the things have changed, technologies have come and gone a bit, business models have come and gone a bit, but fundamentally it's all there. But now, I think for the first time in 100 years or so, we're seeing pressure for real substantive change in the core technologies of this industry and in the ways in which we might think about using cars now and in the future. And those pressures are really beginning to make themselves felt, that we're beginning to see that the industry cannot continue to be as it is. And of course, one of the reasons why it's been so successful is indeed the stability in those core technologies. And we did, in our own research, myself and my colleagues, we identified a key moment in the industry when it adopted the so-called all-steel body. It's an American innovation, came out of a guy called Edward Gowan Budd in Philadelphia. And he was the guy who put together this concept of stamped and then welded steel bodies. Before that time, bodies were kind of built from wood and metal nailed together. They could never be painted properly because you couldn't put them in an oven. It was the last piece of industrialization for the car that made it possible to create a true mass production industry. And what that did was lay the basis for a real pursuit of economies of scale. In other words, as soon as this technology came in, you saw the massive growth of a few big companies, GM, Ford, Chrysler, and of course other companies elsewhere. But equally, we saw a massive decline in the number of small companies that used to be present on the market. So from having, say, 200 or 300 car companies per major country, Germany, France, America, they suddenly collapsed down to a few. And that process of consolidation, economies of scale, have been the key story of this industry since the 1920s up to now. But now things have changed. Now it's possible for new entrants to suddenly make their mark on the industry in the way that, say, Tesla has, or indeed the tech companies. All of a sudden, companies like Google or Alibaba, or you name them, they're all coming into this industry because they see new opportunities around electrification, digitization, the ways in which car companies have perhaps lost the ability to keep those predatory actions out of their market. And so this is a very turbulent time in the car industry, but it's also a time rich with promise because it offers us the opportunity to kind of rethink our relationship with automobility.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of those advancements or push that is happening. I mean, I think in the public, like one thing that comes to our mind when we think about like things happening, we just think about Tesla, right? Because it's such a it's a very loud conversation, and it's not like Tesla is the only one doing such progress in the field. But I think it kind of speaks to a little bit of like the marketing, the show element, let's say, to raise awareness and convey the need of the change in the industry too. So what are some of the developments you see across the industry, and how are they pushed to change, and why the urgency?
Yeah, well, Tesla is a really interesting case. I was never a big fan, I have to be honest. And there's a number of reasons for that. One was that, in a way, what they've done is electrify the worst features of this industry. In other words, what they came to the market with were kind of electrified versions of American muscle cars and big SUVs. Both of those really are very resource intensive for a given amount of transport. So to me, it wasn't a great message in that sense. But what it did do, of course, was make electrification kind of sexy. It made it acceptable. It made it aspirational. In the past, people would think of electric cars as being slow, expensive, cumbersome, limited, and decidedly unexciting. So Tesla really kind of changed that basic landscape. And for that, it's been a very, very important development. However, they did not, as a business, they did not really revolutionize automobility and automobility provision. In other words, the business model they adopted had some minor tweaks, but was not that different from GM, Volkswagen, Toyota. They're going to have big factories. They're going to supply from all over the world to those factories. They're going to distribute back out again to all their customer bases. Right now, they're shipping cars out of China into Europe and into the US. This is a very traditional pattern. Other companies are coming in with the same ideas around electrification, more interesting kind of design approaches and different approaches to the business model design. And so, for me and for my research, I've looked at two kind of major areas, both of which impinge on this. One is business model innovation. So how do businesses redesign themselves to take advantage of new technologies and bring them to market? And on the other side, this idea of transitions. How does society as a whole absorb innovations? How do those innovations permeate into our lives? And what happens as a consequence? Do we adjust and change those innovations? Do they adjust and change us and how we behave? And we're beginning to see that story coming to pass in the electrification of cars. So, instead of, in a simple level, instead of you and I driving down to the gas station and filling up, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just plug in at home at a time that's convenient to us, and away we go. Maybe we've changed our driving habits because of range limitations. We've changed some of our aspirations at the moment around that. So we're beginning to see behavioral shifts associated with this new way of thinking about automobility. And in turn, that's going to fit into a much bigger vision about how we do mobility as a whole. How do we think about, where you are in New York, it's a massively congested city, but compare it with Hong Kong. I once went to a presentation in Hong Kong, and the presentation was by this woman who was the head of their electricity board. And she had this very interesting statistic, which kind of boggled my mind. She said that in Hong Kong, 50% of the population live above the 15th floor.
Oh my God.
Yeah, exactly. Think this one through. So they're all living up there above the 15th floor. There's no way on earth, quite literally, that you can find enough parking space for enough cars for all those people. So there's never, ever going to be the kind of automobility society that you got in the US with these wide open spaces and dispersed suburbia and all the rest of it. So I can see that, the transition that we're engaged in is likely to take us more towards Hong Kong and less towards kind of suburban America. And again, in that respect, I think the kind of Tesla story doesn't speak much to that sort of transition.
Right. That's such a good point. I mean, you touched upon a few things here. One, the storytelling aspect of it, right? Like really changing our perception around electric vehicles, like really adopting new behaviors, because so much of what we do or have been doing clearly for the past many years are not necessarily things that are best for the planet or for our own well-being, right? Like the faster, better, cheaper, bigger is better, you know, all of these like mottos in like the United States especially, it's actually detrimental, and we didn't necessarily gauge at what cost that might all happen. And we see this in cars in US. Like if I go and rent a car and I'm asking for a small car, they don't have a small car in hand. Even though I pay for a small car, they give me a big car because all they have is just like big cars. Do we really need big cars? I mean, maybe if you have multiple children, but so many of the users of those cars don't even have, you know, children. And I think that kind of like changing our own behaviors, our perception of what convenience, luxury means, and really understanding that the whatever like seamless consumer experience is, that might come with a cost. I think that's like one of the first things we have to really discuss and raise awareness around, and hence the storytelling and really communication aspect to it. And another part that you touched upon, as we have, I mean, we have a growing population. Cities are getting more dense, as you said, and there's definitely the way, you know, we are like individual car users is not even a sustainable thing. We simply won't have the room for it, as you said. So to your point, the innovation we see out there is just addressing one thing about the shift need in the industry, and it's mainly around EV, right? Like I don't think, at least in the public, we don't see, we don't. Oh, and also like auto like driving experience, right? So driverless cars. I think those two things are the ones we're hearing more in public. Maybe self-driving vehicles could address some other issues, but to your point, I don't see them as maybe business model innovations, but they're more so product innovations still, and hence not addressing so many of the other things that come with the industry, and potentially creating its own set of problems when being launched into the industry, right? So we talk about electric vehicles or self-driving cars as solutions to some of the problems we're facing today. But what are some of the issues that you think they might also create while we're trying to scale them as solutions today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, well, as we see these things coming into being, all sorts of issues and questions start to arise. I mean, with autonomous cars, for example, I was chatting to a friend of mine recently about this, saying, you know, the day's going to come when the car will drive itself. And he says, oh, great, I can send it out for pizza. Now, this tells you a lot about human nature. But
oh
also,
my God.
this is it. You'll have these things driving themselves around the place. At least at the moment, somebody has to be in it. But if that's our future, then that's a bit of a nightmare vision. So clearly, the way in which we as a society, you know, allow these things to happen and get into our lives is going to be very important. And then, you know, if you look at things like the resource implications, well, actually, things like autonomous cars are a great way of just expanding the market. You know, at the moment, if you're under a certain age, typically 17 here in the UK, but it varies by country, but under a certain age, you're not allowed to drive. Yeah. Get past a certain age, and you've got relative infirmities and so forth, you're still not allowed to drive. Well, autonomous cars, anyone can get in. And so am I going to allow my 14-year-old daughter to hop into an autonomous car and go off to some venue? I don't know. The question hasn't arisen yet, but these are the sorts of things we might have to think about. But what it does do is expand the market. In other words, not fewer cars, but more. So that's a very important distinction. And then on the electrification piece, well, already we've seen flagged up huge issues around the supply of crucial minerals and materials. The most obvious one is cobalt, but there's plenty of others. You know, the war in Ukraine has already kind of thrown up the reliance on some of these materials. And yeah, I think that's going to be a really big one. Now, companies are trying to offer the circular economy as a potential solution. But I think that's really a very long way away. Ask yourself this, you know, if we wanted to replace the current car population of the world with electric cars, that's going to be in something in the region of 1 billion cars.
Wow.
So, yeah, wow. So we're going to take away 1 billion cars and put out 1 billion electric cars with their battery packs. Now, let's just assume for simplicity, that's with existing electric vehicle design technologies. That's a lot of lithium and a lot of cobalt being put into cars and being put out into the market. How many years will it take before the supply of old electric cars coming off that 1 billion stock of cars is going to be big enough just to continue supply of new electric cars? It's going to be decades, if not hundreds of years, even assuming you are able to capture 100% of the waste streams. So as we push down this route, the resource intensity question, I think, is going to become key. This is why I'm highlighting, Tesla's SUVs and sports cars, and indeed, they're not alone in this. Most major manufacturers have gone down this route. They've gone for those big vehicles, high value, $80,000 vehicles. Why have they gone this way? Because it's easy. You can put in a really big battery pack, which gives you the range that consumers expect at hideous cost, but they can also sell those cars at a premium, and therefore, they're appealing to that very special segment of the market. I've got real concerns about this. There's the resource intensity issues, but there's also the social equity issues. Right. And, in all societies, yours, mine, all around the world, there are rich and there are poor. The risk here is that the drive for electrification excludes all sorts of segments of the population, and they're going to be isolated. They will be suffering that transport poverty unless we can find other sorts of solutions and do something about kind of democratizing this electric vehicle transition. So there's a lot of discussion now about that kind of social justice, social equity kind of dimension. But so far, you're not seeing much materializing on the ground. If you've got a nice big house and you've got a nice big driveway, you can put in your charge point, you put in your nice, electric SUV, and life is good and you're nice and low carbon. This is kind of conspicuous minimalism.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really apply to everybody.
Exactly, and therefore not solving our shared problem, because technically we all live in the same place, right? So, I mean,
sorry, Penna, I wouldn't just lay the blame on the industry, or indeed even just on our own consumption patterns. I mean, one thing we really have to look at is the way in which markets are framed and created. So here's a simple example. You may have seen in New York, I don't know, these electric scooters. There's kind of two wheels you stand on, they've got electric power and off they go. Now, imagine that they were created before the car. Streets and everything would be occupied by these electric scooters. People would be zipping around the place going, really, really low energy vehicles. They don't require a lot because they're really just carrying you. There's no extraneous mass in these things. So it's a really efficient mode of transport. But here in the UK now, if you've got an electric scooter, you are not allowed to ride it on the road. It's illegal to ride it on the road. It's also illegal to ride it on the pavement. So where do you ride this thing? Well, essentially, we're saying you don't. And that, to me, is a kind of regulatory tragedy. This is a failure in our ability to allow what is essentially a benign innovation into a system which is really challenged. So it's not just about the technologies, or indeed about industry, or indeed about consumers and markets. It's also about those regulatory framings that we've somehow managed to lose control of what the end game is here. And that, to me, is something that we really need to address further, in the future.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think that sort of policy regulations reflect into so many things in city planning, that we fail to create environments that even make us friendly, make an alternative transportation means friendly for us. I lived in St. Louis for a year, and pretty much 5-minute distance to campus, and I was like, okay, I'll walk there. And my sister, we lived together, she was like, no, you can't walk. I'm like, what do you mean? There are no sidewalks. And it's the only way going there is a highway. You cannot bike, it's not safe. So you do, what do? You go get a car. So I think there's definitely a point where even if you try something else, you just are not able to do it, and out of just like survival and convenience, you end up doing what everybody else is doing. But you know, we unfortunately we also do know that policy always lags, right? So it's very rare that policy actually leads a certain change. And we also see that for an industry to really shift from what it was, it's like it takes generations. It will take generations. And I don't even know if we have that time. So what are some of, I guess, starting points or interventions or potential collaborations with it, like between public private, that you see that can happen and start taking place to at least create more momentum towards change?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And I think in a way, you're a little harsh on the ability to kind of lead change. I mean, we've seen a number of locations, particularly in Europe, have been pushing for a deadline on the phase out of petrol and diesel cars, for example. That's a line in the sand, and it's not moving. And that alone has really made a massive difference to the forward planning of the automotive industry, which tends to think 2 or 3 model generations ahead, in other words, 10 to 12 years ahead. And we're already seeing the results of this. We're seeing, for example, several of the major manufacturers like Mercedes, BMW have said, yeah, we're not going to do any more engine development. It's not worth it anymore. They've also massively reduced already the number of petrol and diesel model variants on the market. So you know, all of a sudden that choice has become much more compressed. And the accelerated pace of uptake in terms of swapping out petrol and diesel cars for electric has been astonishing, particularly in Europe, less so in the US. There are other issues, but it's definitely going on. And regulation has been key to that. You know, this idea of the line in the sand, no more after this date. And of course, what happens is that people in the market think about that date and start taking action ahead of it. In other words, consumers are thinking, do I really want to buy that petrol car in, let's say, 2029, when I know that the ban on petrol and diesel is just coming in? Now, of course, some people will, because some people are kind of die hard on petrol or diesel, but overall, the market will not. And I think it's been really interesting that in terms of the consumer segments, the uptake of these kind of cars has been strongest in the corporate sector. It's not been retail consumers so much. It's been these big corporate users who are quite hard-nosed about calculating costs and, you know, total ownership costs and lifetime costs and all those kind of things. And they've gone down that road and said, you know what, we can see now that electric is really stacking up. Few incentives, you know, concerns about depreciation on petrol and diesel. All of a sudden, you've got a switch over going on. And the interesting thing is, in terms of systems, that switchover starts to become more of an accelerated process of change, not just in terms of the uptake of new technologies, but also in terms of the loss of the old technologies. And this is something we very rarely think about when we're analyzing kind of technology and change. What happens to the old stuff? Now, this is another interesting one, and it's full of quirks and surprises. For example, there was once a story on the BBC about them going to phase out analog transmission, right? That was the old transmission system. They're going to go fully digital. You think, great, you know, digital TV would be brilliant. They hit a problem, and the problem is this. In Scotland, there were still 10,000 registered black and white television users. Black and white TV. Now, color TV came in when I was a child. We're talking 50 or 60 years ago, but there are 10,000 people in Scotland still on black and white TV, still relying on analog transmission.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. And we forget about those things. And we live in such a throwaway society. We assume that, you know, this is what everybody does. We just chuck it away and take on the new. Maybe, you know, we have to think about that a bit. And I don't know what's going to happen with cars, but I did once write a piece about, you know, when and where will the last exhaust pipe be built? And this is just an exercise in thinking through some of the consequences of change. And it is a risk we all face. And, you know, given that, if we just focus on bringing in new, we have to really think about what are the environmental, social, economic costs of the redundancy of the old. And of course, you see this in the built environment. I don't know how it works in the US, but here in the UK, you pay a higher rate of tax, VAT, value added tax. If you refurbish a building, if you build a new building, there's no tax. Inevitably, therefore, there's a bias towards knocking down old buildings and building new ones. So we see these kind of biases built into our society and into our cultural framing. You know, we look forward, we talk about the new, we talk about what's going to change and what's going to be exciting and happening, and we forget about, you know, what's still there, the old, and what we're going to do with it all. So I do see that the transition process, therefore, as we kind of try to create this more circular economy, and as we try to create a more stable relationship with the kind of resources we use out of the earth, we are going to have to think about a much stronger and better management of those kind of waste flows, and doing better at keeping things longer, and then once they've kind of really reached the end of their useful lives, doing better to capture the value again. Now, the interesting thing about this is that some companies are already thinking about it, and I'll give you an example. A really good example is Volkswagen. So what they've done is they've thought through this entire loop on the circular economy and said to themselves, okay, we want to control this resource, the resource being the battery pack with all of its expensive minerals and so on. They want to own and control that throughout its entire life cycle. They're going to build it in their own factories. They're going to standardize it so that it's easy to recycle when it gets to the end. They're going to lease, release, and lease it again, rather than sell the car and lose control of it. And then when it reaches the end of its life, they're going to take that battery pack back. They've already built a pilot disassembly plant to take these batteries apart and extract the materials. And nowhere else is thinking like this. You know, when people talk about the circular economy, they're talking about, you know, multiple entities being involved and engaged in it. And Volkswagen saying, no, we're going to just take that and it's going to be ours. And it raises all sorts of questions. You know, do we trust Volkswagen with these resources? What happens if we want them and they've got them? And can we get them out from Volkswagen? And so on and so on. So I think that's going to raise a whole set of issues around the kind of resources and how we use them. The other thing that's going to happen is we're going to have more and more debate about who gets to use the zero carbon electricity. So right now, a number of companies, Volvo is a great example, are really pushing hard down this route to say, you know, our cars are manufactured zero carbon, and then in use they're electric, so they could be zero carbon. You know, so they're claiming that kind of zero carbon pie, shall we call it? But the amount of zero carbon electricity available to our societies is relatively small. So do we continue to allow mobility, and particularly car mobility, to take that resource? Or do we need to think again about how we distribute our zero carbon electricity amongst all the activities that we're seeking to do? That's a really tough discussion to have, I think, you know, but it will begin to happen because we can't all be zero carbon.
Right. I think the way that you're describing, it just like makes me think we live and operate in a complex system, right? So there's really no like quick win or a quick solution or an easy answer to any of it. And you know, giving guidance or deadlines or incentives is also great because it pushes the industry to start changing, right? So if you give like a 2025 or 2030 cutoff, then people are moving and doing things. But the implications of that cutoff also, who's planning and preparing for that? And is everybody kind of doing it in their own way? Or is there really a genuine collaborative effort to figure out some of these issues that you're raising? I actually was going to ask about leasing and your thoughts on that, because I do question sometimes, like, do we have to own everything we have? Maybe when things break down, we just give it back and replace, and maybe we don't need to have ownership. Do we need to have ownership? Like going back to, you know, maybe a very different question, but if especially there is an issue or a growing issue around resources, and if also the way we do not create waste and have, you know, cars end up in graveyards, like in US, it's like all over the place, right? maybe we do need a center to give it back to. I mean, if we think about it, in any industry or even like consumer product, recycling is very tough. And I'm sure we're doing 80% of it wrong. At least I'm sure I am. I always find out something that I should have been doing and I wasn't doing right, and I keep learning. But if there was this center or resource or a third party that I could just hand it down to, and I know they would do the right thing, that would make sustainability a convenience actually in my life. And I think that's something that we're thinking a lot about these days. How do sustainable practices actually come as a convenience to the consumer? Because we tend to, not know everything, and that's normal. And also sometimes we're lazy. Sometimes we just do whatever is like quick and convenient. I mean, to your point, like apparently if we have self-driving vehicles, we might send them to get pizza for us. So sometimes we don't make the best decisions either. So how do you think, what do you think about leasing, and could that kind of enable sustainable practices come as a convenience to the consumer? Or what other practices do you think we can integrate into the industry that could make this entire shift also more convenient, so more people adopt it?
Well, there's a can of worms. Yeah, you know what? Here's the thing. There was a famous study done quite a few years ago now in Germany about hand electric drills. You know, the sort of thing you have at home to put up, drill a hole into the wall, put up a painting. So the study showed that on average, they were used for 17 minutes total.
Oh my God. Lifetime.
Yeah, lifetime use, 17 minutes. Because people would buy them, they'd stick up their shelf for their paintings, maybe another one a few years later, stick it in the shed. After a while, think it's rusty or falls apart, and they throw it away. So there we go, 17 minutes worth of use from an electric. So then the thinking is exactly as you've outlined. This doesn't make a lot of sense. What if we all just have, a collective drill? And all sorts of attempts have been made since then to create various forms of sharing economy, which would do that. And indeed, in the world of mobility, you get car sharing schemes of various types, and access to mobility in various ways. There's lots of experimentation. I mean, it's one of the most lively areas of the industry at the moment is this whole area of sharing. And there's a lot to be said for it, in the sense that if you've got it linked explicitly to reducing the population of vehicles in a given area, and if it's linked to this idea of improving the quality of life for residents in that area, then you're beginning to see some real benefits. And mostly, these schemes are broadly okay. And the thing is, though, that there's a limited amount of traction with these, and I think the leasing concept is sort of illustrates some of the problems, because in most mature markets, people don't tend to buy cars at all. They effectively rent them per month for a given period of time through whatever you want to call it. It could be leasing, it could be some sort of credit deal, but basically that's what they're doing. And increasingly now, consumers are offered even more convenience in the sense that bundled into one single figure is the price of the car, the price of the servicing, the price of the maintenance, the price of any sort of rescue and recovery that might be required, a warranty failure, blah, blah, blah. It's all bundled into one nice, easy number. They've got one port of call if anything goes wrong. It takes away a lot of the pain and the pressure, so to speak, and gives you a very simple answer. It's X, $200 a month, whatever it might be. And what does that do? Well, that expands the market. That just makes more people want, it makes it easier for more people to get into cars. So broadly speaking, I don't see leasing per se as a solution to the kind of problems of overconsumption in automobility. Whereas the innovations in car sharing could be. There are all sorts of issues around making that work economically, and particularly in the context of electric vehicles. And there are a lot of psychological issues, how people feel. I once wrote a paper about this, about cocooning, and what it is about cars that makes them so attractive. So for me to go to work, I live about 10 miles from work. So I get on my bike and I ride, and then I ride home again. And I've never owned a car parking permit. I've always gone on my bike if I'm going to work. So then I asked myself, why are people in their cars? doing this same trip from my little town here in Penarth into the centre of Cardiff. Why are they doing that when they could be riding like me? They'll get free exercise, it's cheaper, it's even quicker, but they're still in their car. So I was thinking to myself, why? Well, the answer is cocooning, because in that little space, it doesn't matter if they're going really slowly. It doesn't matter if it's what the weather's like. It doesn't, none of that matters. They're in that nice little space that is theirs. You know, they can have their music, you know, they can leave their underwear on the back and it doesn't matter. You know, they can do what they like. It's their little space. And it's the comfort, the psychological comfort of that, which car makers are brilliant at cultivating.
Right.
Did you know, for example, that car makers will tune the smell of leather to different markets?
Wow.
Yeah, or air conditioning. You know, in the US market, they like air conditioning that kind of blows you so fast it nearly knocks you into the back seat. In Europe, we like it discreet. You know, the air conditioning just filter out into our cars, and they create mood lighting and sound systems that wrap around you, and it's all one big sensory experience.
Right.
So, you know, these sorts of things are nothing about the functionality of A to B. They're nothing about the logic of car ownership in a financial sense. They're all about how people emotionally respond to that. You know, I mean, I get my buzz on the bike and that's fine, but other people just don't.
Right.
So addressing these kind of things, it takes more than kind of grim logic and economics or even worrying about the planet. You know, there are other things in there that need thinking about. But there are all sorts of glimmers of light. I mean, bizarrely, the pandemic was a fantastic illustration of how behavior change can be more important than technology change.
Yeah.
Because it was forced on us, you know, to varying degrees in varying countries, but essentially vast swathes of us had to stay at home. And all of a sudden we found, actually life did go on. We found other things, we did other things. In many ways, we had more time because we're not blowing out an hour, 2 hours a day traveling, and save money because didn't need to spend money on fuel and so forth and so on. And increasingly, certainly in the UK, or certainly across Europe, again, not so sure about US, but maybe you know, that idea of the travel to work and the fixed office hours and the regular coming in is already dissipating. You know, for many places, hybrid working is where it's at. So all of a sudden, that assumption of travel to work as a key role for the car, gone.
Yeah.
Interesting. And, you know, the whole world of online delivery of shopping boomed during this whole period. Now, none of us wanted to go into a shop, did we? So again, behavior change. We switched very quickly. And it does show you what is possible. And of course, it required a high level of consensus about, you know, us agreeing there's a problem and agreeing what the solution might be, which could not be enforced. There was no way on earth that you could get a whole bunch of police to enforce this sort of thing. We had to do it ourselves for ourselves, but it did happen. The trouble with kind of climate change is that it is also an existential emergency, but it kind of creeps up on you.
Exactly. It's not treated. I mean, we all agree that we're experiencing a global health crisis, but we do have another crisis yet. It's because it's maybe not as much as in our faces, or I mean, it is in some places, but maybe because of that, we're not treating it as a crisis. And for that reason too, these changes, when they're kind of like forced upon us, right? Like, to your point, because of all our, you know, we're creatures of habits, we have learned behaviors, we have our own psychological reasons why we do things, they may not sustain. Like in New York City, once, you know, the lockdown was over and people started to go to office a little bit more, even if it's like twice a week, not necessarily like 5 days a week, we saw 50% drop in subway use. So that meant more people on cars, and suddenly there were no cars. You couldn't rent a car because there was no car available. Everybody was on the streets, and that was mayhem for New York. So, and that also the ride share that existed with Uber and Lyft suddenly disappeared. because people
Yeah.
didn't want to be sharing cars with strangers,
Yeah.
which, the
Yes.
entire discussion there was like, we were going to reduce the number of cars on the streets by ride sharing, and suddenly that aspect of the business model was gone.
Yeah.
So to your point too, we can change. And when there's urgency, we do change. But when we don't feel the urgency, we immediately shift to whatever is convenient or whatever works better, or psychologically, right? If we're scared of getting sick, we don't share a ride with someone. So those psychological implications and how we might either change them, unlearn some behaviors and learn new ones, or even, create those experiences in different ways. Like if we feel comfortable about cocooning, how might we think of carrying that experience into something else in our daily lives instead of our like commute to work? So I think there's like many pillars to what we're discussing, which makes it fascinating, obviously, but also it makes it very clear that this is a something that we need to address at obviously in public level, like in legislation, at industry level, consumer level. Like it's a shared problem that we all participate in, and
yes, but
Pinar,
it is a shared problem. But I wanted to leave you with one very important point. The latest UN report on climate change, the 6th report, highlighted, amongst other things, wealth. And here's the thing. Yes, it's a shared problem in the sense that we all share the consequences, but we do not share equally in creating the conditions that we are trying to address. And so the distribution of wealth and the use of wealth is key. One of the things that this report highlights, therefore, is that increased wealth, amongst one of the most obvious indicators of increased wealth, is increased mobility of all sorts. People who are wealthy travel a lot. They fly a lot, they go on boats a lot, they go in cars a lot, they travel a lot. So their carbon footprint is disproportionately large compared to their wealth. And in your society and in mine, wealth differences have grown over time. The gap between the very rich and the very poor is getting bigger. And we have to have that as part of our public conversation, because if we are all sharing the suffering, but we're not all sharing the benefits, it's not really a shared problem.
So, it's more shared consequences.
It's a different story altogether. And of course, that happens on a national, nation by nation level as well. There are plenty of nations in the world that their carbon footprint per capita is tiny. Less than 2 tons per annum. And that's one long haul flight in business class. So we don't have enough of a discussion around those bigger issues that aren't really specific to automobility, but are part. Automobility is part of this story.
Mobility.
So we've allowed this idea that we express material welfare in this way, and we've also allowed it to become aspirational. So not only is it that these lifestyles themselves are fundamentally unsustainable, but we aspire to follow them. So there's a real problem there, and so I don't think that's reducible to legislation and regulation and so forth, but things like taxation makes a difference, obviously. And we can see that again with the Ukraine crisis, there's big enough incentive for us in the UK to deal with the oligarchs and their mansions and all the rest of it, and all their mobility needs. So we've been impounding jets and impounding cruise ships and so forth. So I think that's what the UN in a sense is trying to say. The scale of this crisis, the need to do something much more dramatic, is even greater than they have been saying before. The time available is getting shorter, the need for action is getting stronger. Automotive industry, I think, can actually respond to most of that, and is doing so quicker than most people expected. Yes, it's still archaic in its core, but the level of innovation and change has been, for me at least, quite surprising. I always thought, most of my history of working on this industry, the industry itself was focused on stopping change. And what I see now is that the industry has really embraced it and committed to it, in a way that in the past it was just, do we have to do this? Must we do that? But now they see the opportunities, big opportunities to redefine their businesses, be more profitable, have a stronger social relevance, all sorts of things like that. So we should take this moment and run with it.
Certainly, and I have huge faith on Gen Z and onwards. I mean, we experienced the first ever climate strike, and I think the demand creates supply, and we have a generation, and the upcoming generations actually call upon more sustainable and world-friendly measures. And I think that is also another bottom-up push for industries for change. And speaking of, I guess, Gen Z and next generations, I would love to wrap it up with an advice you would love to give them, regardless of what industry they will go into. But if whoever wants to, push progress or make change, what would be your advice to them?
Well, I think my overall advice is, if you really want and are passionate about change for the earth, change for the better, you should stick to your guns, because in the end, the world will come to you. And this is a key thing, that the pressure for change from the younger generations is absolutely vital. Without that, we are doomed. And they will make their voice heard, not only in automotive industry, but any activity, because of this different set of values and this different set of aspirations and the different parameters that they want to work with. So my advice is to stick out there. Don't worry if at first you're worried about not having a career, or you're worried about what the future will hold for you, etc., etc. The world will come to you if you stick to your principles and if you fight for a better world, because in the end, that's what will be rewarded, I believe. I'm heartened by things like the skateboard industry, started by a bunch of layabouts in California doing very little. And now it's a thing, and people do it all over the world. And there's a whole industry around it, in magazines and websites and tournaments and fantastic. Now, that kind of thing is where the future is. And even in the world of cars, the car companies of the future have to be able to recruit young people. That means that those car companies have to be appealing. People need to be proud of where they work and what they do. And if they're ashamed of walking into the doorway of General Motors or Ford or somewhere like that, those companies will cease to exist. So they know it, the companies know it, and they know that they've got to make themselves attractive to younger people. And the best way to do that is to embrace this agenda in its widest sense and really make change happen.
Well, Peter, this was such a treat. Thank you so much. And I'm sure this is going to be a wealth of knowledge for so many, including us. But thanks for making the time.
Pleasure. Good luck. See you again soon.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.